Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 1. Progeny of Hate. Chapter 10. Retribution. The sentinels turned into allies even as it vanquished their ship. The slavers were loath to venture between the jagged points in the dark, and would have to wait till daylight to view their accomplishment. This allowed several of the shipwrecked men to draw clear of the stricken ship without molestation. They had little hope, though, for now they had to brave the cold water and the possibility of predators, with the nearest land several miles to the north. Even if this could be reached, it hardly meant salvation, for the scattered islets were barren and lifeless for the most part, and no one stopped there. It could simply mean a slower, agonizing death from starvation. Rune had hoped that the cold water would revive him somewhat, but his limbs remained heavy and clumsy, his efforts to stay afloat ineffectual. He had resigned himself to his fate when a hand grabbed hold of the back of his shirt and brought him spluttering to the surface again. Indeed, if it had not been for that intervention, he would have ended his journey in the white waters round the sentinel reefs. He was aware of shouted instructions from his rescuer, and the feel of splintered wood beneath his arms and fingers before the washing maelstrom once more engulfed him. But the grip on him held, even though he could not hold on to the roughness of the wreckage. During a brief interlude, he felt his wrists being lashed together to prevent him from being torn away from the planking. Then the desperate struggle ensued to keep from being smashed on the rocks with their makeshift raft. He had nothing to contribute, however, and had to pin his hope on the strength and resourcefulness of the other man. Once clear of the immediate vicinity of the killer reef, he was hoisted out of the water, and could make out that the planking spanned several feet across. This time he tied himself to the raft, before resting his head on the coarse wood and drifting into blackness. His rescuer turned out to be the young man Johin, whom he had seen on the afterdeck when they had been attacked. His strength returned with daylight and wakefulness, and they paddled together, making their way northward under a blue sky and blazing sun. They picked an islet with a little greenery on it before beaching their raft during the afternoon. A quick search revealed the essential water of which their bodies were already in desperate need. For a while at least they were safe. Only then did Rune allow himself to take stock of his situation. Strangely enough, he experienced little of the hot anger that was his usual reaction to such open enmity. The scale of the attack, and his own inability to foresee it and prepare for it, drove him to deep contemplation. He was fortunate to be alive. The attempt had been on his life, hence the drug and accompanying shipwreck, and though he had escaped, there were other losses to consider. It had been a vicious blow. His crew had almost certainly perished to a man, except for himself and the intrepid Johin. Moreover, he sustained the material loss of his ship, and an entire cargo that would have brought a handsome profit. The goods. To the pits with the goods. The loss meant nothing but a quantity of gold anyhow. The crew was almost irreplaceable. Fricka, his pilot, had known the treacherous passage along the Fever Coast like his own home waters round Cairton. Most of the hands had been on several trips to the south of East. The loss of experience was incalculable. There would be a steep reckoning for whoever was responsible. Materially, they were not too well off. True, his blade had somehow remained in the leather sheath during the night, and could be used as a shaping or cutting tool, but they had little else apart from the clothes they stood up in. These could essentially be used to fashion crude sails once they had reinforced their wreckage with driftwood from the islet to construct a decent raft. With such a craft and a favorable wind, it would take 2 or 3 days to reach Cairton. The main concern would be supplies for the journey, notably water. Though they had sufficient supply on the islet, there was no way of taking it with them, and any delays on a waterless journey could prove fatal. Nevertheless, the attempt would have to be made, for they had no hope of being sighted and rescued by passing ships. That night they dined on small crustaceans and an inquisitive fish Rune had managed to spear with a makeshift implement. Being islanders, this was not such odd fare, despite their futile attempts to start a cooking fire, since more than half of the food consumed in Track's Isles was not first singed or boiled. The islanders held that this mainland practice spoiled the subtle flavor of the aquatic delicacies they consumed as their staple. Light seasoning and a good wine was all the preparation required to complement a meal fit for the gods. They spent the next 2 days in shaping a raft of sorts from the seasoned driftwood and wreckage, as well as a rough sail from their outer garments. It was a flimsy affair, but Suntide would offer little in the way of high seas or storms to contend with, and fortune smiling on them, they would be home in 3 days despite the risk. Hope has a quality of depicting the most formidable of obstacles as fleeting moments of discomfort on the way to one's goal. But for this, one might never set sail across the ocean at all. Though the weather held as expected, there was little enough wind, and their progress was leisurely at best. They were used to the sun, cruising the ocean cycle in and out, but now it became a relentless and cruel adversary, beating down on their near-bare bodies without a moment's respite. Initially, they attempted to aid in the advancement of their craft by paddling during the morning hours of calm, or at night when they could escape the paralyzing effects of the heat, but this they abandoned after 2 days, preserving their fast-disappearing strength. The second day was almost completely calm, a breath stirring for an hour or 2 during the afternoon being the only breach in the wall of frustration. They allowed themselves to cool down in the seawater, watching the sail for the first sign of wind, Imran's merciless orb beating down on them out of the blue dome. At dusk they paddled slowly and doggedly, feeling the cramps of empty stomachs and the parched tongues swelling in their mouths. Johin was the first to succumb to the intense demand for moisture. He dropped down on his stomach and lapped the salt water up from his hand, gagging and spluttering, but managing to keep a quantity down nonetheless. Rune had turned himself away and occupied his mind with checking the direction of their lethargic progress with the early stars. His imagination conjured up images he had banished long ago. The icy, clear flow of the darkweed in the hills outside Belruth, the soft rains of Genesis and Greenswell, the succulent sweetness of peaches in the city gardens at Store. Before morning he had followed the example of the younger man, but with less success. The steady breeze on the morrow made them grin at each other with their cracked lips like 2 half-witted juveniles. The breeze held throughout the day, and the heat became much more tolerable. Rune found that the torment of his thirst had receded to an endurable level with the renewal of hope. He could think beyond their arrival in Cairton and the losses he had suffered. His thoughts turned towards vengeance, searching for an object that would bear the brunt of it. By the afternoon of the 3rd day he had isolated a name: Gran. The recent humiliating expulsion from Ligurium at the hand of his brother ruled out the latter as a would-be assassin. Furthermore, his brother's sense of honor would exclude such a course of action as the attackers had followed. Neither was it an attack by an opportunistic islander, since there had been no attempt at securing the valuable cargo, and then slaughtering the crew, but only a deliberate assault with murder in mind. None of his enemies on the mainland had the influence to incite an attack upon him in the waters of Trax Isles without the mute acquiescence of Rasgent in Kilvest, something that was not even remotely possible. Any captain who dared defy the old man would become a quarry for the others to prey on. No, Gron was the one. He had been in Arius during the spectacle. His taint had been conspicuous in the trained adversary on the last day. His scheming nature would churn out a sneaking attack in overpowering numbers, but he was far from untouchable. Even if Rasgent would not approve of feuds among the lords, there were ways and means of getting even that could be just as anonymous as a knife in the dark. All he had to do was bide his time and lull the swine into a false security. He would give it out as though he had no idea who his assailants could have been, and while the slug was still laughing and drinking with his cronies, he would open his gut and feed him his own entrails. Even so, there was still the little matter of his ship. He was sure that Lord Gron would be more than obliging in providing an opportunity to pay him back in kind. His arrogance would make him an easy prey. At the same time, he would be made aware of the fact that his anonymity had been breached, an unsubtle reminder of whom he was dealing with. They reached Caerton late on the 4th day, severely dehydrated and half-starved. There they were made much of amidst cries of vengeance and rage at what was apparent to all had been a deliberate attack of one islander on another. There was no shortage of volunteers to replace the lost crew. As it turned out, though, not his entire crew had perished with the ship. For the very next day, to his great relief, Fricka and 4 of his men turned up aboard a track trading vessel bound for Arran, which had picked them off another of the islets north of the Sentinels. This ship had put in there to replace 2 barrels of water that had somehow sprung a leak and only been discovered 3 days out of Kilvest. Rune hastened his plans for returning Gron's favor. He dispatched 2 men as a lookout to Line Point, the easternmost isle in his realm, to warn him of the approach of any of Lord Gron's slaving galleys on their way to the Aranite waters. It was a pity that he would have to destroy the ship of his rival, for he sorely needed a replacement for his own. But then he did not care much for galleys, which for the greater part fared well or badly by the ability or weakness of their rowers. These were most often slaves, rebellious, and entirely unsuited to combat, even for the saving of their own sorry skins. He had the use of 2 older vessels, but the Claw had been his finest and most suitable for the long voyage to the south. He would have to contract the shipwrights in Kilvest to lay down a similar vessel for him as soon as he could. Either of the smaller vessels would do in the meantime. He picked the 20 men of his new crew mostly for their skill as cutthroats. The next few days he spent in refining their abilities with a foot-long dirk and light-bladed short sword. These would be the only weapons of use to them in the near future. 9 days after his arrival, he noticed the smoking signal from his lookouts, and before the dark of evening could reveal the glow of the fire beneath it, his band had departed for the longed-for rendezvous. The breeze was steady, northwesterly, rippling the ocean surface into substantial swells. Scudding clouds, obscuring the starlight, heralded the approach of rough weather sometime on the morrow. Lauren's eyes peeped through their wispy shroud only occasionally, rendering the seascape as an indistinguishable map of dark motion. Rune could make out the blackened faces of his men as they strained at the oars. The lanterns on the bow of their target glared dully into the gloom, dipping occasionally with the motion of the vessel. It was a smaller ship than the galley that had helped them onto the reefs, perhaps 20 oars to a side in a single tier, and was making steady progress under the square mainsail, gradually bearing down on its doom. Rune's smaller trading ship, the Tyleman, lurked well downwind in the darkness, with only 3 men still on board. The 20 oarsmen would be sufficient to bring the ship's boat close enough to their quarry to use the grappling hooks. They were directly in line now. He could see the port and starboard lanterns rising and falling in unison, the dark hulk of the ship between. He smiled to himself. These predators would not expect an attack of any type. After all, they were the aggressors, the hunters of the ocean, scavenging for the weak or poorly trained sailors and fishermen of all nations. All fled from them in terror, but tonight the unthinkable would happen to them. He silently motioned to the men to cease their rowing. The helmsmen kept their nose into the freshening breeze, enabling them to retain their position across the line of approach of the other vessel, which was running directly before the wind. He felt the hilt of his blade, and then took up the hook with its length of stout rope. 2 of his men did likewise, with 2 more hooks. These would be used if the first were noticed or did not secure the grapple. He knew the foredeck would be deserted, and even if the hook only caught somewhere aft, he trusted in the lazy confidence of the slavers to render them lax during the night watches. As the galley approached, he could not glimpse a soul on the foredeck, though the figure of a reclining man rested with his back against the steerhouse aft. He gripped the roughness of the rope in his hand, and felt the tension tightening his frame. The ship loomed up out of the dark, and his men took up the oars again to edge closer still. The oar ports were shut, the long oars themselves safely shipped. The bow was so close now that he could almost touch it as it slipped past. He hurled the heavy iron over the bulwark, letting the rope rush through his hands. An instant later he felt the slackness and started hauling like a fiend. 2 men behind him had already secured the rope to the mast housing, and were as frantically winding in the slack round the stump where the mast had been removed. They were level with the stern when the rope tightened. The resulting jolt sent most of the men sprawling. At the same time there was a shout from somewhere above them. The steersman had to have noticed the rope. Rune swore to himself, but he merely increased his efforts and braced himself for the impact when their boat would strike the hull of their prey. 4 other men were now hauling behind him in silent rhythmic sweeps, and he readied himself for the leap that would bring his enemies within his reach. Already he could feel the rush of blood, the mind-numbing thrill of battle. The hull struck their boat with a dull thud, but the men on the ropes hardly relented. A face appeared over the bulwarks amidships. A voice hurled a challenge at them from above. The bolt from Johin's crossbow took him neatly in the mouth, toppling him over backwards. Another man took his place, a metal blade glistening in his hand. The 2 remaining irons were flung over the side, more as a distraction than anything else. Rune was close enough now, and threw himself into the air. His grasping hands found the bulwark, and a moment later he was over the side. With a shout his men followed suit, leaving behind one only to secure the rope. But there was an answering shout from below the deck as the slavers streamed out in various states of undress to meet this threat. Rune severed the arm of the sailor hacking at the rope in a single sweep. Then the men were on him. There was little room to maneuver in the press of bodies, and he found himself pinned with his back to the bulwark, struggling with a bald giant of a man who brandished a serrated dirk. The first 2 men of his band to step on board were overwhelmed and stabbed to death almost immediately. 2 more were similarly pinned down, and the rest clung to the side in desperation, unable to reach the enemy. Rune caught the sweaty smell of the slaver as they grappled. His blade hand was disabled by the mighty grip of the sailor's free hand on his wrist, and he could feel his own hold on his adversary's arm failing. He was no match for the giant in brute strength. The arm pulled free, and a prickling spread over his ribs in anticipation of the tearing stab. He snarled and struck the taller man in the face with his forehead. The soft bone of the nose shattered under the vicious blow, leaving his opponent momentarily blinded. He barely had time to twist free and run the blade through the huge torso before the next man was on him. Now he did not allow himself to be bogged down, and felled 2 more men in quick succession. Before this fierce display, the remaining pirates hesitated. forming a half circle around him. Rune faced them, breathing hard. Several more men rushed onto the deck from below. Some of them carried bows and had donned their leather armor. Among them was the captain. Rune feinted to his right, and when the men gave before his rush, he darted over to the struggling knot, where his men were still pinned down. The slavers turned to meet him, while their comrades closed in behind like a pack of hounds on the wolf. He ducked under the wild swipe of the closest man, ran the blade through his vitals, and turned the body to block the blows from 3 more assailants. His men used the opportunity to push back the slavers and allow their comrades to leap on board. Even so, they were badly outnumbered, since their hopes of surprising most of the cutthroats below decks had been foiled. The commander had placed 6 archers on the afterdeck, with their backs to the steerhouse, and these men posed a serious threat to the attacking band's chances of victory. Despite the dark, they could hardly miss at such close range. The slaver captain seemed capable enough, for now he shouted at his men to form up in front of the bowmen. He had judged correctly that confusion was a weapon in the hands of the smaller group of invaders. Once the assault had been stripped of its element of surprise, he could bring the irresistible weight of numbers to bear. The men were hardly disciplined, though, and were already inflamed with the madness of battle. Less than half heeded his call. The rest charged forward to engage the intruders. 2 of these fell under the first volley from their own archers, but another of Rune's men went down as well, a black shaft sprouting between his fingers. Rune urged his men forward, but worked his way around the struggling mass, taking care not to present himself as a target. He was angry that the attack had miscarried so badly, allowing the defenders to inflict such losses. His anger added to the fleetness of his attack. He descended on the archers in swift silence, and before they had time to draw a weapon to defend themselves, the dark horror was among them, hewing and dealing death. The last of the 6 managed to release a shaft at Rune before the blade tunneled through him. It fixed itself in the shoulder of his sword arm, and he broke it off short in one quick motion before the shock of it could dissolve into pain. Nevertheless, he could feel the sudden weakness it caused almost immediately. He wheeled round to face the captain, but instead found 3 men advancing on him with care. Their commander had flung himself into the fight below, where the slavers were getting the worst of it. Rune knew he had to deal with his attackers quickly, for the loss of blood would slow him down ere long. He rushed the man in the middle, who was heavily bearded and wore armor, but the others saw his intention and closed in simultaneously. He felt the jolt as his thrust was parried, and became aware of the inexorable course of the other men's blades through the air. He knew that he would never bring his own round in time to block both of them. There was but one thing to do. A desperate leap caught the armored figure by surprise and knocked him off his feet. There was a curse as the blade swept through the space where he should have been, followed by a sickening thud of metal lodging in flesh, and the short scream of a mortally wounded man. Rune's forward lunge had landed him squarely on top of the bearded man. Recovering quickly, he leaned on his weapon, and it took but a moment to slice through the hardened leather. The man uttered no sound. His body simply went limp, the limbs quivering slightly like a pinned moth. Rune was on his feet again before his other assailants had recovered from their surprise. The swearing man had managed to retrieve his sword from his stricken comrade, who slowly sank to the deck. He sprang forward with a roar of rage. The Nurian twisted his body to avoid another murderous swipe, struck the man a two-handed blow that threw him off balance, and finished him with a darting jab to the throat. Then he rushed to the aid of his men below. The captain's presence temporarily boosted the spirits of the failing slavers. They were once more holding their own against a dozen of Rune's men still in condition to fight. Now they were caught between the hammer and the anvil. The commander was the first to go down, as he turned to meet the new threat in their rear. With his death cries, the remaining pirates dropped their weapons, and set up a wailing chorus of pleading for their lives. It took but a moment or two to dispatch them. A quick search of the vessel ensued, The men brought whatever was of value to the deck and subsequently passed it down to their boat. Rune and Joanne had already set fire to the ship, preventing any leisurely plundering and overloading of their small boat. Their dead were committed to the deep, the wounded lowered with care and made as comfortable as circumstances could afford. Ere long, the men's greed was superseded by their desire to depart the flaming hulk. They allowed themselves to be coaxed back to the boat and shoved off with energy, giving the lie to their apparent battle fatigue. At the first blaze on board the stricken ship, Rune's men on board the Tyleman had lit the foredeck lanterns. They were surprised to note how far the ship had drifted past their own during the struggle that had seemed so brief. It was a good hour's hard rowing into the wind, with fewer hands on the oars, before they could regain the safety of their own deck once more. Rune grimly took stock of the night's work. 6 of his men would never undertake another voyage, while 8 more were wounded, 3 of which grievously. Yet he had achieved his purpose, and paid Lord Gran back in kind. He was sure to hear of his sudden loss shortly, and would realize his mistake of crossing swords with an opponent of equal potency. His men were happy with the haul, which included gold destined for trade goods in Erin, while the families of the dead would be compensated from the booty. Rune's own share would go a long way towards replacing the claw. It had been a profitable as well as satisfactory little venture. The large town and fortress of Kilvest had been sacked and reduced to rubble more times than the oldest of its inhabitants could remember. The nature of its people and past prevented any written record of its history, and only its scarred stone walls and broken bastions testified of the numberless deeds of violence it had witnessed. Here generations of pirates and brigands had been cornered and overcome by ancient Viron and modern Nurians, by brave Aronites and cunning Ligurians, though the sweeping curve of land that braced it from the storms had taken on a name reflecting the unending tide of death, Carrion Bay. Yet it endured, and reshaped itself after every devastating assault, still attracting vagabonds and outcasts, murderers and purse-snatchers from every haven round the inland sea. Once it acquired an intolerable notoriety, the waves of vengeance would once more break on its shores. It was only during the fearful cycles of Kael's madness that the peoples of Myril could not muster the strength or will to check the growing power of the islanders. And at the former's demise during the summoning, there was too much ruin and desolation, lawlessness and feuding to pay attention to the rise of a single ruler in the Isles, and the consolidation of all the cutthroat and slaver bands into a coherent and potent, if unruly, whole. The more resourceful pirate captains had realized soon enough that their only protection against retribution from the several surrounding nations lay in a united effort. They willingly flocked to the Sea Raven standard of Bengor the Red, whose alliance of convenience with Malik Yulian of Terralan had elevated him to the status of a mainland lord in their eyes. Ere long he assumed this title, but was shrewd enough not to let it become hereditary in his family. The Sea Raven Lord in Kilvest would appoint his successor in the presence and with the concurrence of all the lesser lords of Trax Isles. This system sometimes led to bloody feuding and civil strife, when a weaker lord would be favored, and quite often to fierce competition, the shameless currying of favor, and vicious slandering of erstwhile friends and compatriots. The Lord's Hall in Kilvest had often resounded to lively debates and heated arguments when a lord had put off too long the appointment of an heir, leaving the throne vacant at his untimely death. Rasgent, the present lord in Kilvest, was determined that such an unnecessary weakening of the realm should not mar the memory of his highly successful 31-cycle rule. He had not managed to walk the tightrope between the conflicting interests and policies of his several captains, as well as the powerful mainland monarchs, just to see his achievement toppled by the squabbling of the greedy. What he needed was an undisputed successor, a lord of repute, ruthless but wise, who would build on what advantages had been gained in the past, and not sacrifice them for his own gain. He was no fool, and realized the precarious position of his empire of brigands. The other kingdoms only tolerated them because they were temporarily invincible at sea, and had taken great pains to increase their trading activities at the cost of piracy and slaving. The latter had gradually been relegated to a secondary occupation, despite the higher profits to be gained from it. Being a flea on the dog's back was only sustainable while the level of irritation remained tolerable, and even then it was hazardous, however well the flea could defend itself. He glanced up at the rough stone of the ceiling, so different from the castles in Erin where he had spent a tempestuous childhood, yet just as strong and functional. He was struck for the first time by the similarity between these and the faces of the quarreling captains beneath. Somehow they mirrored one another, the unrefined coarseness with an underlying solidity and power. If only they could be held together. It was strange how a rumor or two, however exaggerated, could bring to the fore old grievances and disputes that had lain dormant for cycles. He glanced back at them and suddenly felt his advanced age spark a little fear deep inside. There was Lord Garan, inflamed with rage, threatening and pointing, demanding justice. Facing him was Lord Ruin, his eyes betraying his state of mind. He had the look of a hungry wolf with his prey in sight. Several other red-faced men were throwing accusations about the hall, some based on mere conjecture. But this latest matter had spurred him to call the council. He gestured to a youth behind him to refill his cup, and made every effort to appear disinterested and even bored. He sipped the wine leisurely and refrained from looking at any of the shouting men. One by one they fell silent, till those with the least self-control had made loud fools of themselves, and embarrassed quiet descended. This he allowed to endure for a few moments longer before he deigned to speak.
Whatever ancient grievances you have brought into my hall this day do not interest me in the least. If you have evidence of past wrongs, you may bring the case before me, as is our law. Your behavior gives the lie to the quality of men I know you to be. Do you quarrel like fishwives in the marketplace? Are you not men before whom Myril trembles? Will you be reduced to haggling trollops? I have assembled you to clear up a matter that may endanger our realm, and bring division that will be our undoing. Separately, we are vermin for the hunting of every nation around us. Unified, we keep the crowned heads awake at night. It is strange that I have to remind you of this. Treacherous rumors are about that attacks have been carried out by some lords present on others of their own kind. These are devoid of any truth.
There was a stir among the captains at these words, and Gran could not contain himself.
Lord Master, I have it. Silence!
The old man banged his fist on the table in front of him, causing the empty cup to leap off and roll noisily over the stone floor. He glared at Gran for a moment, then he addressed the gathering again.
This day you have heard the last of this malicious slander. I will not tolerate any remark touching the subject forthwith.
He spat out the last sentence and looked round him defiantly.
All of you may leave, except Lord Gran and Lord Ruin.
He waited till the last man had disappeared, and only the parties requested stood before him, braced for argument. He would allow them no opportunity.
I know that both these rumors are true, my lords, so you may save yourselves the trouble of lying to me. For reasons that I will not disclose, I have decided to declare this little feud of yours settled, here and now. There will be no further attacks, insults, claims, or rumors. If you will not submit to me, I will have you hunted like the dogs you aspire to be. Is this clear to you?
He paused to regard them individually. Rune merely nodded, but his adversary once more drew breath to protest.
Do you presume to know beyond a doubt that my vessels attacked this man's ship?
Gron's cheeks had regained their redness.
I am entirely...
Control yourself when addressing me, Lord Gran, and save your ire for your concubines.
Rastgent's icy tone stopped the slaver in mid-sentence.
I am not as short-sighted as my age would suggest. This entire matter is apparent to me. You should appreciate fully that your life, limb, and entire fortune stands on slippery ground right now. The mercy that I show you now does not stem from any great fondness for you, but merely works to my advantage. I need not impress upon you that this piratical campaign against a fellow captain in my realm will cease immediately. You will also refrain from uttering one more word in accusation regarding the just retribution that has been meted out to you. Remove yourself to your island and do not show your face in Kilvest for an entire season. You may go.
Gron pressed his lips together and bowed his head. Then he hurried off without a word or a glance in Rune's direction. The latter folded his arms, but his expression belied his nonchalance. He waited until the old man addressed him.
I did not expect such rashness from you, Rune. You almost forced me into actions I can ill afford.
I had to respond in some way. That sly...
Rastgent held up a hand.
Why must you let your anger rule your deeds? You are more intelligent than that.
I am not a child, Rastgent.
Then why do you insist on acting like one?
And what would you consider an apt response to that attack? What would you have done in my place?
The old man pondered it for a moment.
As a young man, I might have responded in a similar way. Perhaps even have attempted an assault on Gran himself. Successful or not, I would have had little time to gloat, for I would barely have outlived him. He is an asp, yes, and definitely not worth sacrificing yourself for. But mayhap it is because you do not consider the Isles your home, and would be ready to leave it all behind without a thought that this would not be a sacrifice for you.
His eyebrows were raised, as though he had posed a question, but his voice was merely making a statement. Rune knew instinctively that he had spoken the truth. The Isles would never be his home. He no longer had a home. He did not reply.
But now that I have seen a couple of cycles, I would have tackled it quite differently. I would publicly and loudly have blamed the whole incident on Aaron, befriended my adversary, lured him into a joint venture over time, and killed him when there were no witnesses present.
His face remained passive and unsmiling.
I am no child of Imran, you realize. I've committed crimes of which you are not capable during my long career. I had to, or it would have been a short one. But I never relished it, and I learned quickly never to act on impulse. You will only destroy yourself with your anger and thirst for vengeance, and that will be such a pity.
He rose from his seat and placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder.
I have no doubts that you would have made a better ruler here than I, even though you are far too noble to be a track lord. Your past has destroyed any gentleness that could have spoiled you. You have intelligence, you can inspire loyalty, and you have abilities I could never have matched.
He paused and drew a deep breath.
I'm speaking plain, you understand. You would have been my choice as ruler in the Isles, but you will always be an outsider here, in the eyes of the jealous captains, but also in your own. You would spend all your energy on putting out little fires of resentment and rebellion, no doubt successfully for a while, but ultimately you will let it slip away, because for you it is not worth fighting for.
Rastgent paused again, looking straight into the younger man's eyes.
You do not dispute this.
Rune struggled with an unreasonable anger, but his voice was resigned.
No.
Rastgent sighed and looked suddenly frail and old.
Then you know what you have to do, and why I cannot embrace you as my heir.
The wind gusted from the southeast, infusing the sky with a haze and rendering it a pale blue-white, as if the uppermost reaches of the air had lost its transparency at this intrusion. Yet the golden orb had surrendered none of its potency, dancing in unendurable flashes of brightness off the shifting surface of the ocean, and forcing up the sailors' hands as shields whenever they looked out over the water. Rune allowed the rough fingers of the breeze to ruffle his hair. His eyes were mere slits, his brow slightly furrowed, but he kept his hands on the bulwark of his ship as she sped homeward towards Cairton, though his gaze was fixed on the horizon. His thoughts did not make cheerful companions. He was running again, perhaps not this season or the next, but as soon as he could afford. That much was clear to him, and seemed to be the only lucid thought he could muster. He was surprised at how little it all mattered to him. Ras Gent had certainly been right. The Isles could never be his home. He did not want it to be, and as soon as there was a new master in Kilvest, his welcome here would expire.